What's a story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. Several years ago, around 10 p.m., I was dispatched, I was a deputy at the time, to respond to a call from a woman who reported hearing strange noises outside. I arrived at her house, which was on the corner of two small streets with no streetlights. The entrance to her home was on one street, while the entrance to her driveway and carport was on the side street. When I knocked on her front door, she politely asked me to identify myself. After reassuring her that I was an officer, she stepped outside, wringing her hands and telling me how embarrassed she felt for calling. She was a short, chubby, older woman who led me around the side of her home to her carport, explaining that she had been preparing to leave when she heard scraping and moaning noises. She was worried that something or someone was out there. I searched her carport, yard, and even inside her home, but found nothing. Since she was elderly and lived alone, her yard and carport were mostly unkempt. There were no signs of anything being trampled or moved on the dusty concrete. I walked her around the property, pointing out the distinct lack of evidence, and assured her that I would keep an eye on her home for the rest of my shift. Shortly after, she got into her car and left. A few hours later, she called again, saying there was blood on the door leading into her home from the carport. At first, I didn't think much of it, as I had driven by her house multiple times and hadn't seen anything unusual. When I arrived, she was parked on the street in front of her driveway, her headlights illuminating the house. As I approached her car, she seemed calm but confused. She told me she had pulled into the carport and noticed what looked like blood on the door. She backed out onto the street and called for assistance, saying she wasn't particularly alarmed, but felt it was best to report it since she had heard noises earlier. At that point, I was starting to think she might have been a little paranoid. But as I walked up the driveway, I could already see something on the door. There were no footprints or tire tracks in the mud. When I reached the carport, I got a closer look at the substance. It was red, and there was a lot of it. Then I smelled it. It was unmistakably blood, and it was everywhere. The blood started about halfway up the carport and continued all the way to the door. There were 3 small steps leading up to it, and they were drenched in blood. The door itself was smeared with bloody handprints, on the knob, on the glass, and all over the frame and walls. The way the blood was smeared, it looked as if someone had collapsed against the door while bleeding heavily, then desperately pounded on it, trying to get inside. But the door was still locked, and there were no bloody drips or footprints leading away. I immediately called for my supervisor and a K-9 unit. By then, I was genuinely unsettled. This was far more blood than I had initially imagined. I had the woman turn off her car and stayed with her until my supervisor, zone partner, and the K-9 officer arrived. My sergeant began roping off the house with crime scene tape, while I prepared to join the K-9 officer in a search. My zone partner stayed behind to take a statement from the woman. Before we left, while the blood was still fresh, we collected samples, scooping a small amount into a DUI blood sample kit and absorbing a larger quantity with paper towels to store in an evidence bag. The dog never picked up a scent. We searched for over an hour, checking 5 nearby homes and a large wooded area across from the woman's house. But we found nothing. No more blood, no body, no footprints. None of the neighbors had heard anything, and dispatch had received no related calls. We also checked with hospitals in our county and the surrounding areas. There were no reports of patients with injuries severe enough to account for the amount of blood we had found. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. Story 2. 7 or 8 years ago, during a stretch of hot, dry August days, I attended a bluegrass festival at Thomas Point Beach in Brunswick, Maine. The headliner that year was Ralph Stanley, a legend in the bluegrass scene since the late 40s, who had recently gained national attention because his song "Oh Death" was featured in the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" soundtrack. On the day of Ralph Stanley's performance, I was standing front left of the stage. He was dressed entirely in black, from his boots to his cowboy hat, and I remember thinking he must have been sweltering in the heat. The performance started as expected, talented but standard, until after 3 songs the band suddenly stopped playing. Ralph stepped forward a few paces, grabbed his mic, and after a brief pause began singing "Oh Death" in his haunting, quavering voice. Just a few lines into the song, I noticed people around me turning away from the stage. I turned my head and realized I was standing at the edge of a cleared space in the crowd. At its center, a heavyset woman lay sprawled on her back, with someone kneeling beside her, administering CPR. Ralph Stanley, already quite old at the time, likely couldn't see what was happening, despite the fact that it was only about 30 feet from the stage. He just kept singing, "You run my life right out of my soul. Oh, death, please consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage." A woman standing beside me, a complete stranger, touched my arm and without taking her eyes off the scene muttered, "Do you hear this? Is this actually happening right now?" By the time the song ended, the man administering CPR had stopped. She was gone. Later, we learned it was a heart attack. The crowd stood in stunned silence. In that moment, you could hear nothing except the distant wail of an approaching ambulance siren. That night, my friend struck up a conversation with the fiddle player from Ralph Stanley's band while getting an autograph. The conversation eventually led to an invitation to jam with the band on their tour bus. At one point, during a whiskey break, my friend asked the band members, "So, that was pretty intense out there today, huh?" The fiddle player just laughed, took a shot of whiskey and said, "Shit, that's happened like 4 times." Story 3. I posted this in another thread a while ago. I'm sure I'm late, and this will get buried, but here goes. 2 summers ago, I was driving home from my boyfriend's house. About a mile from the highway, there was a cut-off road that led onto a dirt driveway, which used to be a slaughterhouse. Now, they just used it for cattle sales. That night, around 1 a.m., I was driving along, minding my own business, when I saw a chicken truck halfway in the main road and halfway in the slaughterhouse driveway. I slowed down to a crawl, and as I got closer, I saw a man running from behind the building toward the truck. He stepped up to open the cab door, but it must have been locked because he couldn't get it open. Then he turned and started running toward the road, waving what I think was a flashlight. As I approached, panic set in. I swerved around him, and as I did, he smacked my passenger door and screamed something. I had no idea what. I didn't stop. I gunned it. When I reached the stop sign up ahead, I checked my rearview mirror. And that's when I saw another man running toward the first guy. Before I could process what was happening, the second man swung what looked like a 2x4 and hit the first guy in the head. The man collapsed right there in the middle of the road. I sped off and pulled into a parking lot a couple of 100 yards away. I know some people might think, why didn't she stop to help? But it was late, it was dark, I was alone, and I was terrified. I called the cops immediately and told them what had happened. They said they would send someone to check it out, but I wasn't about to stick around. About 2 weeks later, they found a body in the river a few miles away. I'm almost certain it was the same guy. The news even mentioned an anonymous 911 call. They chalked it up to a domestic violence case. Apparently, the guy had been sleeping with another man's wife, and that man turned out to be his own son. Messed up, right? It took me months to convince myself it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done to save him. But deep down, I still wonder. Maybe it was my fault, or maybe, if I had stopped, we'd both have ended up in that river. Story 4. About 35 years ago, my newlywed uncle and his wife were driving back from their honeymoon in Texas to their home in Campeche, in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Their VW Beetle had started acting up toward the end of their first day of driving. The roads in Mexico back then were terrible, and the drive from the Texas border to Campeche took nearly 24 hours. To make the trip manageable, they had planned to take 3 days to get home. But when their car broke down, they were forced to stay in an unfamiliar town for 2 days while it was repaired. Once they were back on the road, they decided to push through the night so they could have at least 1 full day of rest before going back to work. By early evening on the second day of driving, they arrived at a small town somewhere in Veracruz. They stopped at a gas station on the outskirts to fuel up and grab something to eat. There was a small taco stand nearby, so they decided to eat there. The old man running the stand was friendly, and before they knew it, they were telling him all about their honeymoon in the U.S. When they finished eating, they thanked him and got up to leave. But the old man suddenly asked where they were planning to stay for the night. My uncle told him they were going to drive straight through. The old man's demeanor changed immediately. He looked worried and told them they should find a hotel. My uncle explained that they really wanted to get home and have a day to rest. But the old man insisted. It wasn't safe to drive that road at night. He even pulled out a newspaper and showed them an article about a bus that had disappeared a few days earlier. It had left town but never arrived at the next city. Search parties had looked everywhere but found nothing. And there was nothing between the two towns, just empty road. My aunt was unnerved, but my uncle laughed it off. A few minutes later, they were back in their Beetle, heading down that same road. A few miles in, they hit a thick fog bank. That wasn't unusual in the Sierras, so they didn't think much of it. But shortly after entering the fog, they started seeing lights ahead. some stationary, some moving. My uncle slowed down. As they approached, it looked like a work crew was repairing the road. The fog was thick, so they couldn't see the equipment clearly, but they saw figures moving. And then, the road itself changed. The rough, pothole-ridden surface suddenly became smooth. The change was so drastic that my uncle was convinced they had just driven past an actual road repair crew. As they continued, they saw more work crews along the roadside. About an hour later, my aunt made an observation that sent a chill through my uncle. There was no traffic going in the same direction as them. At the gas station, there had been a steady stream of vehicles. But now, nothing. Only the occasional truck or bus heading in the opposite direction. Another 20 or 30 minutes passed. Still no cars traveling in their direction. My aunt told my uncle to pay close attention to the next truck that passed them. The next time they saw headlights, my uncle focused on the truck's side panel. It had some kind of advertisement, but the writing was in a language he had never seen. It looked like a mix of Korean, Japanese, and Arabic. The next truck was the same. Then he started paying attention to the work crews. The equipment looked futuristic, too clean, and the workers, he couldn't put his finger on it, but they didn't move right. He later described it as moving like insects. At this point, my uncle told my aunt they would drive until they either reached the next town or hit half a tank of fuel. Several more hours passed. Still no town in sight. When they finally reached half a tank, my uncle pulled over, grabbed his pistol, and stepped out of the car. Immediately, he felt wrong. His instincts screamed at him to get back inside. The air felt heavy, unnatural. The hairs on his neck stood on end, and it took every ounce of willpower not to scream and jump back in the car. Just then, he saw headlights. A truck was approaching, slowly. It was going to stop. That was it. He lost it. He jumped back into the Beetle, yanked the wheel into a U-turn, and floored it. In the rearview mirror, he saw the truck come to a complete stop. Then it disappeared into the fog. The drive back was identical. Work crews on the side of the road, no traffic in their lane, only trucks passing in the opposite direction. They kept driving until they reached the curve where the road had smoothed out. But this time, they passed through the fog and back onto the rough, pothole-filled road. Eventually, they found their way back to the same gas station where they had stopped earlier. Exhausted, they parked near the taco stand and slept for a few hours. The old man woke them up the next morning, knocking on their car door. He was relieved to see them. My uncle told him what had happened, how they had driven through the fog, past the road crew, and taken that curve. The old man frowned. "There is no curve on that road," he said. "It's a straight shot to the next town, about 30 miles away." My uncle argued, but when they got back on the road, he realized the man was right. They never saw a work crew. They never took a curve. And this time, they reached the next town in less than an hour. Story 5. A few years ago, a girl in my suburb had an episode, I guess that's what you call it, and murdered her mother, father, and one of her sisters. She also stabbed her other sister, who attempted to escape but survived. She had serious mental health issues, including schizophrenia, and had been seeking help. There was some debate in the community about whether she was taking medication or refusing it due to her religious beliefs. Regardless, it was well known that she was struggling. It turned out that a guy I used to work with was dating her at the time. He had been trying to help her, but as things worsened, he was also trying to end the relationship. What he told me about that day still chills me to this day. She had come home from therapy. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She went into her room, sat in silence for about an hour. No arguments, no muttering, nothing. Then without a word, she calmly walked through the house, unnoticed by her family, and locked every door and window. Only then did she begin her attack. The surviving sister managed to break a window and escape, alerting authorities. Meanwhile, the girl eventually stepped outside, sat quietly on the front step, and waited until she was taken into custody. The fact that she locked all the doors and windows first, that's the part that still haunts me. Story 6. Some days Dad would get into a strange mood, like he was waiting for something, apprehensive, as if he were bracing himself. By the end of the day, he would briefly lighten up before a flicker of dread passed over his face. It became something I grew accustomed to over the years, and I never questioned it. Then Pop died. At the time, we knew it was coming. He had worked around asbestos for decades and had developed mesothelioma. Watching him deteriorate was painful, and my dad was struggling to stay positive. It was his father, after all. "It could be any day now," the doctors told us. "We just don't know when." One morning, after spending the night at my dad's house, I woke up to find him sitting at the dining table, his head in his hands. I sat down. He looked at me exhausted. Later, I would learn that he had been awake in that spot since 2 a.m. He's gone, he said. Gone? I knew what he meant, but I was confused. I didn't hear the phone ring. He hesitated, then told me about the ladies in their kitchen. It was never in the same place. Sometimes it was a house he walked into, floating the way people do in dreams. Once it was a windmill in a field, another time, a cave. But the setting never mattered, because once he crossed the threshold, it was always the same kitchen, the same cabinets, the same paint, the same food, and then there were the women. His grandmother, his maternal great-grandmother, his paternal great-grandmother. Women he had known in life, long passed on. Never more, never fewer. Just the same three women sitting in the kitchen. They never speak, he told me, voice quiet. Not at first. This dream would come in a series. It could last for days or weeks, each dream different, but always ending in the kitchen with these women, silently watching him. The longer they didn't speak, the more anxious he became, like an invisible weight pressing down on him. And then one night, I walked in last night, he said. Had to cross a highway and swim to reach this tiny house where it was. Walked in, and they were sitting at the table. They always had teacups filled. One extra cup sat in an empty seat, waiting. They always looked up as if interrupted during a grave conversation, and then one of them spoke. Sit down, Jeffrey. My dad fell silent after saying this, rubbing his eyes and flexing his hand. I waited. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. That was the end of it, he said. Not just of that dream, but the sequence of them, and of something else. I still didn't understand, so he explained. These dreams only happened when someone he was close to was about to pass away, and the women only invited him to sit once the person was gone. This last dream had woken him at 2 a.m. He already knew, without a call, without a notification. He picked up the phone, dialed the hospital, and his grieving mother answered. She had been about to call him with the news. We had Pop's funeral. We buried him. I didn't say anything about the dreams. How could I? I was 15, caught up in high school, worrying about my grades, my friends, my life. I wasn't about to tell anyone about my dad's visions. Years passed, from high school to college. I found my place, my independence. My dad's dreams faded into the back of my mind. Then one night, a friend brought a flyer to my dorm, excitedly telling me about a psychic, Lady D, who was coming to campus. She's the real deal, they said. We have to go. I didn't believe in psychics, but I figured it would be fun. Lady D gathered a small crowd in the common area, speaking about spirits and the other side. It was typical fortune teller stuff. Then she invited us to ask questions. On a whim, I asked, do you believe in spirits that watch over us? Like guardian angels or something? Her response made my stomach drop. One of the women who watches over your father is here with you. She paused as if listening to something unseen. She says he can see her in a kitchen. But don't worry. The fact that she's here means no one's about to die. Story 7. This is a true one that happened to me. When I first started at university, I had nowhere to live due to an oversight by the administration. I knew a guy from a forum in an online game who was on my course, and I asked if I could stay at his place until I found my own. After much begging, he reluctantly agreed. When I arrived at his house, all of his housemates were already living there, so I had to sleep on the sofa. A day or two later, his next-door neighbor, also a student, moved in. She was the first to occupy a 5-bedroom house. We quickly became friends, and she invited me to stay in one of her spare rooms. The first night I slept there, I woke up in the middle of the night, turned over, and saw a woman, probably in her early 30s, older than the girl living there, wearing a bonnet and sitting in a chair beside my bed, knitting. I knew instantly what I was seeing, but I didn't panic or feel scared in the slightest. I just turned over and went back to sleep. That's the creepy part. A few days later, I found my own place and moved out of my new friend's bedroom. A few days after that, the girl who was supposed to live in that room finally moved in. She later told my friend that she had seen exactly the same thing I had, down to the last detail. I had never mentioned it to anyone, so there was no way she could have imagined it from something she'd heard. I still don't believe in ghosts, but to this day, I swear I saw one in that bedroom. Story 8. On March 23, 1994, The medical examiner reviewed the case of Ronald Opus and concluded that he had died from a shotgun wound to the head. Mr. Opus had jumped from the top of a 10-story building, intending to end his own life. He had even left a note indicating his despair. However, as he passed the 9th floor, his life was cut short by a shotgun blast from inside the building. Neither the shooter nor the deceased was aware that a safety net had been installed just below the 8th floor to protect some construction workers. If not for the gunshot, Ronald Opus would have survived his suicide attempt. The room on the 9th floor where the shot was fired was occupied by an elderly man and his wife. They had been in the middle of a heated argument when the man, in a fit of rage, grabbed a shotgun and pointed it at his wife. When he pulled the trigger, he missed her entirely, and the pellets flew out the window, striking Mr. Opus. Since the man had intended to harm his wife but instead killed a bystander, the authorities ruled it as murder. However, when questioned, both the elderly man and his wife insisted they believed the shotgun was not loaded. The man admitted he had a long-standing habit of threatening his wife with the unloaded weapon, but claimed he never intended to actually hurt her. The case took a turn when investigators found a witness who had seen the couple's son loading the shotgun about 6 weeks prior to the fatal incident. It turned out that the elderly woman had recently cut off her son's financial support, and knowing his father's habit of brandishing the gun, the son had secretly loaded it, expecting his father would end up shooting his mother. Since the son knowingly set up the situation that led to a death, he was held responsible for the murder of Ronald Opus, even though he never pulled the trigger. But then came the final, shocking twist. Further investigation revealed that the son was, in fact, Ronald Opus. He had become increasingly despondent after his failed attempt to orchestrate his mother's death. In his despair, he decided to take his own life, only to be killed by the very situation he had set into motion. In the end, the medical examiner ruled the case a suicide. Story 9. Once upon a time, there was a man made entirely of pillows. His body was a pillow, his head was a pillow, all his fingers were pillows, even his toes were pillows. He stood about 9 feet tall. The Pillow Man had a very sad job. He also had a unique power, the ability to travel through time. His mission was to go back and visit children who would grow up to live terrible lives. He would try to convince them to leave the world early, sparing them the pain he knew awaited them in the future. One day, the Pillow Man visited a little girl who he knew would grow up to have a tragic life. He told her about all the horrible things that would happen to her, but she didn't believe him. She said, "I'm happy, Mr. Pillowman. I've always been happy, and I'll always be happy." The Pillow Man looked at this joyful little girl and realized he couldn't bring himself to convince her. Years later, he visited her again, only this time, she was an adult. She asked him, "Why didn't you stop me, Mr. Pillowman? Why did you let me live this life?" The Pillow Man simply said, "You were such a happy little girl." With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "But Mr. Pillow Man, I've never been happy." He watched as she made a heartbreaking choice, and he knew he had failed her. The Pillow Man grew weary of his job. If he succeeded, a child's life would end before it had a chance to begin. But if he failed, they would grow up to endure endless suffering. The burden became too much to bear. He decided to do one final job. After that, he would be done. For his last journey, the Pillow Man traveled back in time and found a little boy sitting behind a tree. "I want to talk to you, little boy," he called out. The boy stepped out, but it wasn't just any child. It was the Pillow Man himself from the past. The Pillow Man told his younger self about the terrible future that awaited him, about the dreadful job he would have. The little boy listened and understood immediately. He reached for a small can of gasoline, poured it over himself, and struck a match. As the flames consumed him, he looked up and asked, "Will you tell my mommy I won't be home for dinner?" The Pillow Man nodded, lying, of course. As he faded away, he heard the distant echoes of cries and pleas, the voices of all the children he would never save. Story 10. 9/11 affected everyone in my area deeply. I grew up in northern New Jersey, right across the Hudson River, and I still remember the thick black smoke covering the skyline for a week, the overwhelming sadness, and how everything just came to a standstill. The local hospitals were overwhelmed, and the entire community felt the weight of the tragedy. My mom's good friend's husband was a Port Authority officer. The day after the attack, we learned that he hadn't come home, and no one had heard from him. My family spent a lot of time with her, trying to reassure her that no matter the outcome, things would eventually be all right. On September 13th, she received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, it was her husband. He told her he was trapped under the rubble and that, although he knew he wasn't going to make it, he had managed to help a few people escape. He kept repeating that he was going to be fine, that this was what his life had been meant for, and that she should try to contact the people he had saved. It was heartbreaking. The way she described that conversation gave me chills because, even in the midst of chaos, she and her husband remained calm, almost as if they had both accepted the inevitable. Sitting in her living room as she explained everything in a quiet, steady voice was something I will never forget. A week later, during cleanup efforts, his body, or what remained of it, was found. Story 11. Mid-October 2001, I was 13 years old at the time. My family, including my grandpa, uncle, mom, sister, and I, was visiting our cousins at their lumber yard and farm. The land was huge, surrounded by thick boreal forest, winding rivers, and vast farmland. My cousins were entrepreneurs who owned the lumber yard, the surrounding fields, a log cabin business, and several hunting shacks that they rented out to hunters, mostly from the U.S. My cousin Banner was a year younger than me. He had a large family, but most of his siblings were much younger. His sister and my sister were around the same age, 3 years younger than I was. We spent our days exploring the woods and our nights camping in one of the work shacks at the lumberyard, watching old movies on a small TV. That night was supposed to be just like any other. At around 10 p.m., Banner and I were in our sleeping bags, watching Son-in-Law in the work shack. It was a clear night and the moon was bright enough to light our way outside. Suddenly, Banner heard a tapping sound on the window. He sat up, thinking it might be an animal. Then we heard the door creak open slightly, but no one entered. Seconds later, we heard screaming from the west. We bolted upright and ran outside. I noticed some rustling in the trees, but didn't think much of it. Our sisters came running toward us from the forest path that led to our grandparents' house. At first, we thought they were messing around, but when they started calling our names frantically, we met them halfway. They had decided to come to the work shack to scare us. On their way through the trees, they saw a man standing near the path, watching them. Thinking it was one of us, they spoke to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he started mumbling, stretching his arms out as he walked toward them. That's when they realized they didn't know him, and they ran. Panic set in. We jumped onto Banner's quad, the girls clinging to the back, and sped east toward his house. That's when we saw him again. A man stood in the middle of the gravel road, one hand covering his face, the other reaching out with his palm open. Banner swerved into the ditch, and we kept going. When we reached his house, we turned on every light we could. Banner grabbed a rifle from the gun cabinet, and we locked ourselves in the garage, waiting. Our family was still at our grandparents' house, so we were completely alone. Looking back, I regret not heading straight to our grandparents' place, but at the time, fear made us act irrationally. Then we heard it, a gunshot in the distance. We sat in silence, terrified. 5 to 10 minutes later, another shot rang out, this time much closer. Less than a minute later, a third shot fired. It felt like an eternity. But then suddenly we heard voices, familiar ones, shouting our names as someone entered the house. Our parents burst through the garage door, ordering us to get in the truck. We begged them to tell us what was happening, but all they said was, "Be quiet, and we're going back to your grandparents' house." As we pulled away, I saw 2 figures lying in the grass about 30 feet from the house. When we arrived at our grandparents' place, we were rushed into the basement and told to stay put. Upstairs, we could hear tense, hushed conversations, but we couldn't make out what was being said. 30 to 40 minutes later, the police arrived and questioned us separately. Afterward, we were taken to a relative's house in a nearby town. No one would tell us what had happened. Years later, my uncle finally told me the full story. Our cousins had rented one of their hunting shacks to 3 men from the U.S., 2 brothers and their father. One of the brothers had a mental illness, but according to those who knew him, he functioned well most of the time. That night, something changed. The police found blood, pieces of a human tongue, and cut rope in the shack. 2 of the men had been bound together. Outside, there were 3 sets of footprints leading away from the cabin, each following a slightly different path. One of the men had escaped first. The second had tried to follow but couldn't keep up. The third set of tracks led directly to our work shack before veering off to where my sister first saw the man, then doubling back toward us again. That's where they found the body of the sane brother, shot in the head. His footprints followed our quad's path down the road before ending at the second body, the father, who had been shot in the stomach but was still alive. Banner's dad and my uncle had heard the first gunshot and immediately rushed to the work shack, knowing we were inside. They found the first body and grabbed a rifle before driving toward Banner's house. As they arrived, they saw the mentally ill brother shoot his own father. When he turned the rifle toward them, Banner's dad shot him, killing him instantly. That was when they found us, and the rest is history. Story 12. About 5 years ago, I was over at my friend's house. Their hot water tank had just broken, so a group of us stopped by to help. The interesting thing is that his dad had built the house a few years earlier. Everything was brand new, and their family had installed everything themselves. While removing some wood that was used for the wood-burning stove, we noticed a crack in the cement wall. After the hot water tank was fixed, my friend's dad offered to buy us lunch and dinner if we repaired the wall. So we got to work. The first step was removing a chunk of loose cement. As we pried it out, one of my friends spotted an old locked wooden box inside the wall. Confused, we called my friend's parents downstairs since we had no idea what it was, but neither did they. That's when we started getting freaked out. My friend is an only child, and this wall was constructed when the house was built. There was no reason for anything to be inside it. When we got a closer look at the box, we noticed a crude carving on its surface. It read, "I will be back March 23rd, 14. Needless to say, everyone was on edge. My friend's dad set the box aside so we could finish repairing the wall. Later that night, after the work was done, he grabbed some tools to open it. It took about 20 minutes, but eventually he pried the lock off. Inside there was only one thing, a note. Scrawled across the paper were the words, "Why did you open this without me?" Naturally, my friend's dad started making calls. He contacted every family member who had worked on the house, but none of them took responsibility for the box. No one had put it there. So now every single person who was there that day plans to return to the house on March 23rd of next year to see if anyone or anything actually comes back. Story 13. This is a completely true story. I didn't exaggerate or add any details. This happened several years ago when I was 19. It was summer, probably June. I was staying with my best friend who lived with her grandparents. Around 11 p.m., we decided to drive down to see some friends in Tulsa. It was about a 4-hour drive from Kansas City, but it was the weekend, and we figured our friends would still be up partying when we got there around 3 a.m. We grabbed some snacks, got in the car, and hit the road. Now we had driven to Tulsa many times before, but the only route we knew was Route 69, a small 2-lane highway. We wanted to take the interstate since it was nighttime, but we didn't have a map, her grandparents didn't have internet access, and this was right before GPS became common, so we took the only road we knew. Route 69 between Kansas City and Tulsa runs through the middle of nowhere. The entire drive is either cornfields or dense woods. At night, there are no lights besides your headlights. And at that time, there was no cell phone service the entire way. We were completely on our own, with no backup plan if something went wrong. We were having a great time, windows down, music blasting, eating snacks, until things started getting weird. 2 hours into the drive, we were reaching the point of no return. We had just enough gas to get either to Tulsa or back home, so whatever choice we made, we were committed. At this point, the road was surrounded by thick forest on both sides, only a few yards from the pavement. Then we saw it, blood. At first, it was just a small splatter on the other lane. No big deal. We figured someone had hit a deer. But as we kept driving, the blood kept going and growing. Over the next 10 miles, the blood went from small splashes to massive pools. At one point, it covered a 3-car length stretch of road and ran off into the trees. That's when we realized something wasn't right. It was far too much blood for a deer. And even if someone had hit an animal, there was no wreckage. No fur, no body parts, no broken glass. Just fresh, glistening blood. We hadn't passed a single car in either direction, and considering the blood was on the other side of the road, if someone had hit something, they should have passed us by now. But there was nothing. A deep, gut-wrenching feeling settled in. Something was very wrong. Then out of nowhere, I had to slam on my brakes, a roadblock. It came out of nowhere. There had been no warning signs. The barriers looked old and barely legitimate. They were the striped sawhorse-style barricades, but the wood was rotting, and the words "road closed" were so faded they were barely visible. And then we saw the sign. Off to the side of the road, nailed to a tree, was a small wooden board with the word "Detour," yes, spelled that way, painted on it in dripping red letters. The sign pointed to a narrow dirt road that led into the pitch-black forest. At that moment, we knew we had to get out of there. And for some reason, we decided to switch drivers. To this day, I don't know why we didn't just go. We both jumped out of the car to switch, and as we did, we heard them. Whispers, movement in the trees, on both sides of the road. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. My friend floored it, and we never looked back. We drove straight home. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. When we got back to her grandparents' house, we snuck inside, locked the doors, and went to bed, never telling anyone what had happened. To this day, we have no idea what was in those woods or what was waiting down that dirt road. All I know is that if we had followed that sign, we probably wouldn't have come back. Story 14. This may get buried, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Well, I haven't heard this story. It actually happened to me, and it gave me chills. I grew up in a small town, about 4,000 to 5,000 people. Everyone in our high school pretty much grew up together, knew each other, and were friends. When this happened, I was in the military and had a week of leave right after basic training. It was midsummer and my friends wanted to go out for a drink and hang out before I left for a long time. I don't drink, so I was the designated driver. Around 1 a.m., I decided to cut the night short, not because anyone was drunk, but because I was exhausted and just wanted to get some much-needed rest. I decided to take a drive through my town's main street, which was poorly lit and had a lot of empty lots and alleys. I was driving a 4-door car, probably a Mercury Sable, a real piece of junk, honestly. As I drove, I noticed a woman walking on the sidewalk. She looked really familiar, and after a couple of seconds, I recognized her. It was Erin, a good friend and former girlfriend from high school. I pulled over a little ahead of her and got out. As soon as she saw me, she recognized me, and we hugged. She asked about boot camp, and we caught up. While we were talking, I noticed 2 guys in dark clothing lingering nearby, probably following her. Something felt off, so I stepped in front of Erin. Now, I'm not a small guy. Back then, I was about 6 feet 1 inch and 190 pounds of pure muscle, and these 2 didn't look very athletic. I raised my voice a bit and asked, "Can I help you, gentlemen?" They didn't respond, just stood there. I didn't like the situation at all, so I told Erin to get in the car. Once she was inside, I followed and pulled away from the curb pretty fast. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw about 6 more guys emerging from an alley about 20 feet ahead of where I had picked up Erin. They gathered around the 2 I had seen earlier, and it looked like they were talking. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if I hadn't been there at that exact time and place. Still gives me chills. I guess I was lucky I took the long way home that night. Story 15. Between my junior and senior years of college, I stayed at my townhouse alone while my roommates went home for the summer. That year, there were several break-ins reported in my neighborhood. The reports were terrifying. Girls would wake up to a naked man standing in their bedroom, just staring at them. He would run out when they saw him. Nothing was ever stolen, and nobody was physically harmed, but it was still disturbing. As a woman living alone, hearing those stories freaked me out. My boyfriend stayed over as often as he could, but when he wasn't there, I always locked my bedroom door. First thing I did when I moved in was install a real locking doorknob. One morning I woke up and noticed dirt on the carpet in front of my room. I didn't think much of it, figured I must have tracked it in when I went upstairs after work the night before. I took a shower, got changed, and stayed upstairs for a while. When I finally went downstairs, everything seemed normal at first. The doors were locked and the windows were closed, but then I stepped outside and saw something strange. The screen from my bedroom window was lying across the lawn. That's when it hit me. The dirt on the carpet, the mulch leading up the stairs. Someone had broken into my house, and if it weren't for my locked bedroom door, I probably would have woken up to a stranger standing in my room that night. The worst part? When I reported it to security, they barely took it seriously. Since nothing was stolen and I didn't actually see anything, they didn't even bother to investigate. Story 16. This happened when I was little, but it connects to something even stranger from before I was born. I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. Sometimes when I woke up in the morning, I'd see my mom standing on the other side of the room, just looking at me. Sometimes she was in her work uniform, other times in regular clothes. Whenever I saw her just standing there, I'd say, "Mommy," and she would disappear. It never scared me. I was too young to find it weird, so I just learned that saying her name would make her disappear. I even started reaching out to her. When I did, she'd still disappear, but slower. This happened on and off for a couple of months. Then one day it just stopped. My mom was very much alive during all this, and on the days I saw her in her work clothes, she was actually at work. When she was wearing regular clothes, she had been out shopping. She was never home. My dad or my brother was home, but not her. I never mentioned it at the time because, to me, it wasn't weird. Years later in middle school, I got into reading about the supernatural. I found a book about astral projection and thought, this sounds exactly like what happened to me. I went to my dad. He was always more interested in paranormal stuff than my mom and told him my story. His face went pale. Then he told me his own. Back when he was in the Navy, my mom and he lived in North Carolina. They had neighbors they hung out with all the time. One night while watching TV, my mom braided her hair, something she never did because it was too hot. She fell asleep on the couch next to him. About an hour later, their neighbors called in a panic. "Scott, where's Sandy? She's sleeping right here. Why?" Scott, Kathy, and I were in bed when we both saw Sandy standing at the foot of the bed. Her hair was up, which we've never seen before. We asked her if something was wrong, and she just disappeared. My dad said he figured they were just tired or hallucinating. But after hearing my story, he wasn't so sure anymore. Around the same time, I got interested in genealogy and learned my great-grandmother was Native American. My mother's father was considered half Native American, making my mom 1/4. I started researching folklore and found something interesting. Some tribes believed in dream walkers, people who could leave their bodies while sleeping and travel to other places. I don't know if my great-grandmother was a dream walker, but if she was, maybe that ability got passed down. Story 17. About 5 years ago, my mom, twin, and I went to Hobby Lobby to get supplies for a project. My twin saw a little tube of expensive gold leaf paint and really wanted it for her project on Queen Elizabeth I. But after seeing the price, my mom said no. Upset, my twin ran off somewhere in the store. My mom and I kept shopping, and when we were ready to leave, she sent me to find her. As I wandered through the aisles, my arm started to feel tight, almost like someone was squeezing it. I shrugged it off as a weird growth spurt thing. Then I spotted my twin running through the fake flower aisle at full speed, like she was being chased. Confused, I followed her and found her unwrapping a decorative sponge and placing it into a large ornate vase. "Mel, what are you doing? We have to leave now. And why are you putting a sponge in a vase?" She grabbed my arm and whispered, "No time to explain. I'll tell you when it's safe." When we got to a quieter part of the store, she told me about a ghost, a little boy dressed like he was from the early 1900s. He wanted to play a game, hiding and finding the sponge. I helped her look. When I found it, I heard a faint hooray and saw the boy smiling before fading away. At checkout, my mom noticed my arm. It had small red handprints all over it. The little boy had been trying to lead me to Melissa. I turned back and saw him waving goodbye, crying. I'll never forget him. Story 18. In 2003, when I was 11 years old, I was in the hospital for a bone disease called osteomyelitis. I made friends with other kids in my ward, week after week, watching them heal and be set free, as I used to say. But one really cool kid stood out. He was the kindest friend I had ever had. Unfortunately, due to complications from birth, his body was severely affected. His shoulders sat near his chest, his ribs were misaligned, and his knees were not straight. Long story short, he always knew he wouldn't live a full life. His parents had struggled with addiction, and he lost them when he was just 4 years old. He was placed with a foster mother and spent his school years being bullied for the way he looked, the way he walked, and for who his parents had been. He had been in and out of hospitals for countless surgeries. Before his final operation, he told me, "Graham, if you're gone by the time I come back, I just want to say thanks for being my first and only best friend. And please take this as a gift." He handed me a set of rosary beads and a drawing of me. He had an incredible talent for art. The next morning, I woke up to his foster mother crying at my bedside. He hadn't made it through the operation. I was shocked and heartbroken, but his foster mother turned to me and said, "Thank you for giving him some joy before he left. You were his only friend. He was an amazing kid." Story 19. My friend's grandmother told me this story. She was born a little after World War I in Germany, in a small village near the Czech Republic border. When World War II began, her village remained relatively untouched, until one fateful winter day. The village was near a heavily wooded area, with rivers, hills, and lakes. For weeks, Russian planes had been flying overhead, and the townspeople had learned to stay inside when they saw them. One day, after a heavy snowfall, she and the other children went sledding down a big hill. Her older sister and younger brother were with her. Then the sound of engines filled the air. Russian planes. Most of the kids panicked and ran for home. Her sister told her to hide in the bushes while she went to find their younger brother. Moments later, the shooting started. She heard the bullets ripping through the air and the screams of the other children. Frozen in fear, she stayed hidden. When she finally emerged, the entire hill was covered in red. Most of the children who had been playing that day lay on the snow, either dead or barely alive. Her siblings were among them. She said it was an image she could never forget. Story 20. Not a ghost story, but still one of the creepiest things I've experienced. I work at a women's shelter, and over the years I've heard plenty of disturbing stories, but this one still stands out. One day, two women came in together, one in her 50s, the other in her early 20s. They told us they were aunt and niece, and that the younger woman had gotten involved with a gang member who was threatening both of them. They were a little odd, but we had seen worse, so we welcomed them and did our best to help. A few days later, the younger woman completely snapped. She started screaming at another resident, accusing her of flirting with her aunt. She yelled that she would kill her, kill everyone, and began throwing kitchen chairs across the room. One of my coworkers tried to de-escalate the situation while I called 911. By the time the police arrived, she had calmed down, but both the niece and the aunt were escorted out of the shelter. 3 months later, my coworker brought in a newspaper and showed me an article about those two women. Turns out they weren't related at all. They were actually lovers who moved from shelter to shelter, and they had just been arrested for murder. The man they had been staying with was found dead. Story 21. This is my favorite creepypasta. It's long, but worth it. In 1983, a group of deeply religious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. They theorized that if a human had no access to any senses, no sight, sound, touch, taste, or smell, they would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, the mind would be free to establish direct contact with the divine. An elderly man who had nothing left to live for volunteered as the test subject. To strip him of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation, severing every sensory nerve in his brain. He could still move, but he could no longer see, hear, feel, taste, or smell. He was completely alone with his thoughts. The scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud, describing his state of mind in slurred, broken sentences. 4 days in, he claimed he could hear faint voices in his head. The scientists dismissed it as psychosis. 2 days later, he started speaking to what he believed was his deceased wife. He insisted that he was communicating with her, and even more disturbingly, he could hear her responding. The scientists weren't convinced until he started revealing personal information about the researchers, details only their deceased relatives would have known. At that point, several of the scientists abandoned the study. After a week, the subject became overwhelmed, saying the voices wouldn't stop. He started banging his head against the walls, begging for sedatives. He pleaded to be put to sleep just to escape the endless whispering. They granted his request, sedating him for 3 days. But when he woke up, things got worse. He began screaming and clawing at his non-functional eyes, desperate to feel something, anything in the real world. The voices, he said, had become deafening. They spoke of the end of the world, of hell. At one point, he screamed the words, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. Eventually, his words became unintelligible. He stopped speaking altogether, only making guttural, animalistic sounds. He started biting into his own flesh. The scientists had to strap him down to prevent him from harming himself further. For hours, he lay there in silence. Then suddenly, he turned his head, despite being blind, and locked eyes with a scientist. In a whisper, he said, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." His vital signs stopped. No one could determine a cause of death. Story 22. I've been lying down for hours now. It's 5:35 a.m., and there's not much I can do. You know what the worst part about my situation is? I'm in the same room with my parents. They keep looking at me, and I can't help but look back, trying not to cry or scream. Their eyes are fixed on me, and their mouths hang open. There's a strong scent of blood in the air, and I feel paralyzed with fear. Here's the thing. If I make any hint that I'm awake, it's over. I will die, and there's nobody around to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only idea I have is to rush for the door, run outside and scream for help, hoping my neighbors hear me. It's risky, but if I stay here, I'll surely die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on. I get ahead of myself sometimes. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up and went to check on the noise before realizing I had to use the restroom. Instead of doing the smart thing and investigating first, I used the bathroom. I could have gotten myself killed right then because of my stupid actions. But I actually did my business and took a peek outside. There was blood on the carpet. I panicked and ran back to my room, hiding under my sheets like a coward. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, that it was just some really vivid nightmare or something. Then I heard the bathroom door open. Like the terrified child I was, I peeked from under my blanket to see what was happening. I saw something dragging my dead parents into the room. It was not human, I can tell you that. It was hairless, with no eyes and no clothing. It walked like a caveman, its back slouched as it dragged their bodies. But this thing was far smarter than any caveman. It was fully aware of what it was doing. It propped my dad up on the edge of my bed, making him face me. Then it sat my mother down in the chair and positioned her toward me as well. After that, it started rubbing its hands against the wall, smearing it with blood before drawing a circle with a pentagram in the center. This thing had made what it probably considered a masterpiece. To finish it off, it scribbled something on the wall that I couldn't read in the darkness. Then it crawled under my bed, waiting. The scariest thing now? My eyes have adjusted to the darkness, and I can finally read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it. The thought alone is horrifying, but I feel like I need to see it before I die. I glance at the creature's masterpiece. I know you're awake. Story 23. We made a mistake. That is the simple, undeniable truth of the matter, however painful it might be. The flaw was not in our observatories, for those machines were as perfect as we could make them, and they showed us only the unfiltered light of truth. The flaw was not in the predictor, for it is a device of pure, infallible logic, turning raw data into meaningful information without the taint of emotion or bias. No, the flaw was within us, the orchestrators of this disaster, the sentients who thought themselves beyond such failings. We are responsible. It began a short while ago, as these things are measured. Less than 66 daily ago, though I suspect our systems of measure will mean very little by the time anyone receives this transmission. We detected faint radio signals from a blossoming intelligence, 214 dailies outward from the galactic core as photons travel. At first crude and unstructured, these leaking broadcasts quickly grew in complexity and strength, as did the messages they carried. Through our observatories, we watched a world of strife and violence, populated by a barbaric race of short-lived, fast-breeding vermin. They were brutal, uncultured things, stabbing and shooting and burning each other with no regard for life or purpose. Even their concepts of art spoke of conflict and pain. They divided themselves according to bizarre cultural patterns and set their every industry to the cause of death. They terrified us, but we were older and wiser and so very far away, so we did not fret. Then we watched them split the atom and breach the heavens within the breadth of one of their single short generations, and we began to worry. When they began actively transmitting messages and greetings into space, we felt fear and horror. Their transmissions promised peace and camaraderie to any who were listening, but we had watched them for too long to believe such transparent deceptions. They knew we were out here, and they were coming for us. The orchestrators consulted the predictor, and the output was dire. They would multiply and grow, flooding out of their home system like an uncountable tide of devourer worms, consuming all that lay in their path. It might take 68 Delis, but they would destroy us if left unchecked. With aching carapaces, we decided to act and sealed our fate. The gift of mercy was 84 strides long, with a mouth 2/4 that in diameter, filled with many 44 weights of machinery, fuel, and ballast. It would push itself up to 2/8 of light speed with its onboard fuel, then begin to consume interstellar primary element 22 to feed its unlimited acceleration. It would be traveling at nearly light speed when it hit. They would never see it coming. Its launch was a day of mourning, celebration, and reflection. The horror of the act we had committed weighed heavily upon us all. The necessity of our crime did little to comfort us. The gift had barely cleared the outer cometary halo when the mistake was realized, but it was too late. The gift could not be caught, could not be recalled or diverted from its path. The architects and work crews horrified at the awful power of the thing upon which they had labored, had quietly self-terminated in droves, walking unshielded into radiation zones, neglecting proper null pressure safety, or simply ceasing their nutrient consumption until their metabolic function stopped. The appalling cost in lives had forced the orchestrators to streamline the gift's design and construction. There had been no time for anything beyond the simple, massive engines and stabilizing systems. We could only watch in shame and horror as the light of genocide faded in infrared against the distant void. They grew and they changed in a handful of lifetimes. They abolished war, abandoned their violent tendencies, and turned themselves to the grand purpose of life and art. We watched them remake first themselves and then their world. Their frail, soft bodies gave way to gleaming metals and plastics. They unified their people through an omnipotent communications grid and produced art of such power and emotion, the likes of which the galaxy had never seen before. Or again, because of us. They converted their homeworld into a paradise by their standards, and many 106 of them poured out into the surrounding system with a rapidity and vigor that we could only envy. With bodies built to survive every environment, from the day-lit surface of their innermost world to the atmosphere of their largest gas giant and the cold void in between, they set out to sculpt their system into something beautiful. At first, we thought them to be simple miners, stripping the rocky planets and moons for vital resources. But then we began to see the purpose to their construction. The artworks carved into every surface, traced across the system in glittering lights and dancing fusion trails. And still, our terrible gift approached. They had less than 22 daily to see it, following so closely on the tail of its own light. In that time, oh, so brief, even by their fleeting lives, more than 1,010 sentients prepared for death. Lovers exchanged last words, separated by worlds in the tyranny of light speed. Their planet-side engineers worked frantically to build sufficient transmission capacity to upload countless minds with the necessary neural modifications, while those above dumped lifetimes of music and literature from their databanks to make room for passengers. Those lacking the required hardware or the time to acquire it consigned themselves to death, lashed out in fear and pain, or simply went about their lives as best they could under the circumstances. The gift arrived suddenly, the light of its impact visible in our skies, shining bright and cruel even to the unaugmented ocular receptor. We watched and we wept for our victims, dead so many dealers before the light of their doom had even reached us. Many 60s of those who had been directly or even tangentially involved in the creation of the gift sealed their spiracles with paste as a final penance for the small roles they had played in this atrocity. The light dimmed, the dust cleared, and our observatories refocused upon the place where their shining blue world had once hung in the void. We found only dust and the pale gleam of an orphaned moon, wrapped in a thin, burning wisp of atmosphere that had once belonged to its parent. Radiation and relativistic shrapnel had wiped out much of the inner system, and continent-sized chunks of molten rock carried screaming ghosts outward at interstellar escape velocities, damned to wander the great void for eternity. The damage was apocalyptic, but not complete. From the shadows of the outer worlds, tiny points of light emerged, thousands of fusion trails, single ships, world ships, and everything in between. Many 106 of survivors, in flesh and steel and memory banks, ready to rebuild. For a few moments we felt relief, even joy. We were filled with the hope that their culture and art would survive the terrible blow we had dealt them. Then came the message, tightly focused at our star, transmitted simultaneously by hundreds of their ships. We know you are out there, and we are coming for you.